The norm now in society is like, let's get everyone to eat every 3 hours and have 5 or 6 little meals through the day. And I think that's a bad norm to start from. I think if the average person trying to lose weight started from this idea of going back to great-grandparents and saying, let's just have the 3 meals. That way, you end up getting into a caloric deficit without really trying. You end up, the more you can go between meals without getting hungry, typically the better your metabolic flexibility, right? The better you are from burning carbs to fats versus that person who's overweight and insulin insensitive. They really want to just burn carbs. That's why they're getting a lot of those cravings versus the fact that their body should be able to just click over, break down body fat for a fuel source and keep on going, but they'll struggle, right? There'll be some irritability and some cravings. But for a lot of people, doing things like basic, very low intensity things like walking first thing in the morning, fast in a fasted state for me is really nice. I mean, I know the research is still not totally clear there, but I think for simplicity's sake, it's really easy for people to say, I'm going to wake up, maybe I'll have a coffee or a green tea, I'll go out and do my walk, I'll do some light exercise in the gym, get it, in and out. I think the biggest problem most people have is they think they need an hour. And if you're new to a lot of exercise or you haven't trained for a while, I'll take 10 minutes. I'll take 12 minutes. We'll just repeat squats on the minute or some pushes or some variety of things that we can do in a very short period of time, because that will get us to where we want to go.
Hey guys, it's Mike Mutzel here with HighIntensityHealth.com. Thanks for tuning back into another episode. We're live today with my friend Dr. Marc Bubbs. He is a lead nutritionist for the Canadian national basketball team, naturopathic practitioner, and also a certified strength and conditioning specialist. I kind of get tongue twisted with that one, CSCS. He's also the author of this great book right here called The Paleo Project. So we're going to take a deep dive into diet, lifestyle, and exercise strategies that can help you feel your best and perform your best. So Dr. Bubbs, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Awesome. Thanks so very much for having me here. Appreciate it.
I would love to kind of take a deep dive about your practice. I know you work with a lot of athletes and the Canadian national basketball team and a lot of like high-end executive weekend warrior type. So
for sure,
it must be kind of a different mindset, right? When you're treating a high-end athlete versus the weekend warrior, because like you mentioned, some of these athletes are like at 5-6% body fat. So diving into like a ketogenic style diet may not be so good for them, right? So talk about this kind of personalized approach.
Definitely. I think that's a great question because like we mentioned previously talking, context really matters. So who are you dealing with? Are they, an elite athlete or an intense athlete, whether they're a weekend warrior or professional athlete? Are they someone who's trying to lose 30 pounds and improve their health? So that's where personalizing the approach to them, whether it's how they eat in terms of low carb, high carb, everything in between, how they train even. I mean, a lot of people, especially amateur athletes, can always be pushing that, more burn the better, more days training the better, and that idea of efficiency gets kind of lost, and so it's easier for them to get sort of run down and, the repercussions of that in terms of fatigue and cravings and all sorts of things. So
Sure.
And lifestyle factors too. Those are the kind of the real big rocks that we had mentioned previously. Things like sleep and stress control, and so those are things that we got to consider for whether you're trying to perform at your best, you're a professional athlete, whether you're trying to work hard, play hard, or whether you're someone who's just trying to lose 30 pounds and feel a little bit better. Trying to dial in the changes for them. And the cool part is that it doesn't have to be this huge sweeping changes, right? People think they got a 180-degree turn from what they're doing. It's normally like 10 or 15 degrees off what they're doing, but the trouble is for them figuring out what that 10 or 15 degrees is, right?
Yeah, and so that's where you created this big rock analogy. It's funny, I thought you were talking about skeletal muscle. I was telling you offline, because you've been giving a lot of these presentations to healthcare practitioners, and I thought rocks, like muscle, you were talking about that. But explain kind of that paradigm shift of like moving these big rocks and what that means for lifestyle change.
For sure. I mean, I think that's a great skeletal muscle as just a health marker is phenomenal. It's something that we don't use enough as clinicians to evaluate the disease risk factors for all of our patients as they get older, right? Because we know if we just keep lean muscle on clients, all those health risks go down. So that's a big part of it. But the analogy around the big rocks is this idea of these are the real themes, whether it's your health, your work life, whatnot, that are the major themes, right? So the big rocks in terms of health are diet, exercise, lifestyle. We're so amazing in acute and in regular traditional medicine at acute and emergent care. If you get sick, if you get hit by a car, surgery's phenomenal. But it's amazing how, on the other hand, the chronic stuff, we just let it build and we let it build and we let it build. And once we get over that edge and we have a pathology, that's when things kick into action. And it's ironic because with the crowd that I deal with, I mean, in terms of their portfolio, their investments, they would never wait until things get in the red and then decide to change things. And of course, they would never wait until a project at work was going down the drain and then decide to change. So it's just this idea of looking at the writing on the wall and saying, hey, how do we get things back into the right direction? And that's where diet, exercise, lifestyle, all the major medical journals, as you know, tell us that's 90% of all chronic diseases. But at the moment, less than 1% in the medical schools are giving education in those areas. So that's where I think there's a huge opportunity there for people to really take control of their health and to be an active player in the game in terms of rather than just having to be told what to do or what to take.
But I like that you're not totally anti-Western medicine because you got malaria, right? I heard that on another show, so it's kind of interesting. Why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's amazing how people, again, pro this or pro that, everything's a tool. If we think of everything as a tool, you got to use the right tool at the right time. And I was after university traveling some and was in Africa, and ironically, after doing a lot of traveling, never got sick, never got malaria or anything like that. And of course, I only got stung by a few mosquitoes when I was in West Africa. And I came back here, was doing my studies in naturopathic medicine. Got sick, went into the hospital, and of course I told them I'm pretty sure I've got malaria, and they looked at me like, what's this guy talking about? But sure enough, I only got bit a couple times, but one of them was the winner there. So I actually had the worst type of malaria. Like I was resistant to the medications here in Ontario, so they had to go back to the old school quinine to actually get my levels down. So it was
interesting.
The only kind that can kill you, but thankfully the once it's clear, it's clear. But that's where, I mean, Western medicine, phenomenal. Without that, maybe I wouldn't be here, who knows?
Well, I'm glad that you kind of differentiate that, because a lot of your colleagues, I found amongst the naturopathic community, are very anti-drug, very anti-Western medicine, and don't look at it like as a tool, like you said. So it's good that we're kind of not trashing any one modality, we're kind of appreciating them for what they are in that context, which is really important.
For sure, and I think it's a problem we get into a little bit in Western medicine, is that we tend to have these problems with people where we go to those approaches first, and they are the most powerful, and sometimes for blood sugar problems, which we have a lot of, or hypertension, or dyslipidemias and cholesterol issues, we go to those powerful weapons first, and we kind of ignore the bigger rocks, if you will.
So let's take a deep dive with moving those bigger rocks around, and start out with diet. I know it's a big focus of your book, and you really talk a lot about insulin and cortisol. And so for the weekend warrior that wants to go out and hammer and push it, even though they're getting up at 5 in the morning and burning the candle at both ends, where do we start with balancing that diet and lifestyle and for optimizing both performance in the workplace and on the true field?
For sure, I think this is where no matter what dietary strategy you pick, I think most experts and docs will agree that if we can have a dietary strategy that leads to a nice, slow, and sustained release of sugars into the bloodstream, so this constant drip feed of energy, we're going to be in a good spot. Now, again, context matters. We have a lot of athletes here, even at the club, that are cyclists. They log hundreds of kilometers a week on their bikes, but they're 20 pounds overweight. So now we think, wait a minute, for performance, we're consuming all these simple sugars on the bike and maybe more carbohydrates than we need throughout the day. But if you're holding on to that much extra weight, we got to think to ourselves, well, this isn't so good for us in the long term, because now we're exposing, we know if you have more belly fat, things like systemic inflammation will be elevated, greater risk of dysbiosis and more of the bad bacteria. So then we got to ask ourselves, well, is this really the best feeling approach for this person who's weekend warrior and doing it for pleasure and competition, but they're not getting their salary from it. So in terms of this performance side, we got to figure out how we can maximize health and exercise, because as you get to the elite level, those two directions, those aren't inherently in the same direction. When you get to a really elite or Olympic level, you're pushing the body to a degree for an athletic achievement, which is amazing, but doesn't inherently make you more healthy. And I think a lot of Olympic athletes will tell you after some of the games, it takes them a long time to recover from that type of training, right?
Yeah, really important point, that longevity and optimal physical performance are not necessarily congruent all the time. I think that's a huge point, because so many people are really pushing it, training hard, because they hear that exercise is healthy and they're taking it to the extreme. So do you see that quite a bit, this overtraining syndrome amongst the weekend warriors?
I think that's definitely one where we get stuck into, we've got 3 different energy systems. People like to be in that middle one where we get that glycolytic and burning effect, especially muscle fiber types as well. We've got, we like to be in that lactic acid, because people can feel it, and they feel like they're having, they're creating a change, an adaptation. But like anything, once you've trained a system to a certain degree, whether it's 8 weeks or 12 weeks, once you become adapted, you're getting very little benefit, and the drawbacks now become more significant, especially on that sort of glycolytic or burning type training. And people, it's tougher for them to say go out and do sprints, and I might ask them to do a 50-meter sprint and then rest for 3 minutes. The average type A person won't rest for 3 minutes.
What am I going to do for 3 minutes?
They'll do some jumping jacks, they'll do some push-ups. They want to work during the rest, but what they don't understand is that it'll take away from their next work effort, which is actually where all the magic happens. So it's, especially on different types of training, it doesn't really matter what you're doing in the rest. It's the work period that's the key part. And of course, when you when you say sprint for 50 meters, you get different energy systems, different muscle fiber types than you would do with the other type of training. And so I think that's where people, especially this type of client, that weekend warrior, is always pushing that same system, and so they're paying a lot in now, and the dividends they're getting out are very low because they've already adapted to that. Right. And that's where we can get into this fatigue, nervous system fatigue, classic ones. People start cravings, cravings for sugar. All of a sudden you're walking home and you're grabbing a chocolate bar or a bag of Twizzlers or something like that. Caffeine's another one. All of a sudden they're drinking more caffeine in the day. So this is some of the things that we tend to notice in people who are just kind of pushing and not thinking about how do we get the most efficient with what we're doing, so you can get there with sort of the least amount of effort. Right?
Yeah, really important. But the athlete tends to justify the cookies or the whatever because they train so much, so they burn like maybe 1,500 calories. I was a former competitive cyclist, so that was me. So you just described me, right? And so when you're in that overtraining syndrome, you're like, well, I just train like for 4 hours, so I can eat whatever I want, right? And then, but it is this like almost like pathological relationship with training and then with food, and so it creates this weird dynamic. So
yeah, and that's interesting because obviously being a professional will be a little bit different there, in that performance is your number one marker, but we actually see in a lot of professional endurance athletes, when we look at their HA1Cs, their 3-month average of blood sugars, they're much higher than we would think, because exercise is actually a great way to normalize that, but they're still at the upper end of normal. Yeah. We see levels of systemic inflammation that are a lot higher than normal. You say, wait a minute, we're doing things to make them perform well, but in terms of the health, that's where we're kind of losing out a bit. And so, again, for the weekend warrior, I think you can marry that. Yeah. And then for the professional athlete, that's where we got to then figure out, okay, well, how do we get you to perform your best? And then when you're not really peaking for competition, how do we patch you up as best we can to get you healthy again?
Yeah, and so those markers of inflammation, elevated hemoglobin A1C, suggestive of maybe underlying insulin resistance you mentioned in those chronic endurance athletes. Is that in basketball players you're working with too, or mostly like the triathlon?
With our group, in terms of basketball players, you do get more of like the Ectomorph builds, so they're burning quite readily. You can load on a lot of calories. They still walk into training camp at 6% body fat, 8% body fat, abs and everything. So this is where it's tougher for the average person to kind of square that circle, because for them, having to work so hard to get leaner, if that person can actually consume a tremendous amount of carbohydrates, still perform well, still be lean, but your average person who's 20 pounds overweight, if they've been consuming too high carb a diet, the more out of shape, the more belly fat, the more poor their health, and typically the worse their insulin sensitivity, like you mentioned, is, which means, when they consume the bagel and orange juice for breakfast, once those insulin levels get elevated, they're not going to be able to burn body fat very effectively, if at all. Yeah. And of course, the craving comes at 10 o'clock, and now we have there's always this little dose of food that makes sure that they're never in burning mode, they're always in building mode, in spite of sometimes being in a very low caloric intake. And I know that's frustrating for a lot of people who are just saying, hey, how can I lose this 20 or 30 pounds? I don't eat that much. But it's those little things that then start to matter for that group, for sure. Yeah,
so really kind of honor your body composition and your build, like ectomorph, mesomorph. Do you want to quickly run down, so if people haven't heard that term, ectomorph, what does that mean, and what are the other variations there?
Yeah, the two main ones that we'll think about, the ectomorph's kind of that taller, leaner, sort of basketball player, volleyball player. They tend to have a hotter metabolism, so they burn through things well. Their, adrenals, if you will, are more of that adrenaline cortisol picture, so they're kind of always on the go. And you see that more in endurance athletes as well. Whereas on the opposite end of the scale, the endomorphs are more of your pear and apple shaped, for the guys, maybe the offensive lineman, the rugby player, their metabolism is not going to be as robust and as hot. So different types are going to be able to hold on to weight more. Let's say like an endomorph may be able to build muscle more easily, but then it's more tricky for them to burn body fat. Interesting. Whereas the ectomorph can burn fat more easily, but it's tougher for them to hold on to muscle. So we get problems at each end. And of course in the middle is the mesomorph, which is typically the
solid linebacker.
Strong, solid, and never had a problem, so we don't focus as much on them because they're normally doing pretty well, but they still have their own little set of issues that can come up too.
Interesting. Yeah. So that's where it comes down to like personalizing the carbohydrate intake, because I know you talk about that in the book a lot, kind of going back a little bit to diet, where some people can do really well on those carbs, like the ectomorph, right? So the long, skinny, but the endomorph, who really is kind of a little bit soft, a little pudgy, if you will, would maybe do better on like a ketogenic or lower carbohydrate style diet, right?
Yeah, and I think that's where one of the issues we have when we just look what's around us, this sort of Western diet. The average person goes to find food at a breakfast spot or a fast food spot. The carbohydrate choices are tremendous, right? It's muffins and toast and bagels and croissants and juice, and so the choices around us are all leading us in this direction. And of course, once your insulin starts to get a bit dysfunctional, cravings and the leptin function, leptin's that satiety hormone, that starts to get skewed as well. So people tend to think of, I'm hungry, it's mid-morning, I need more food. When really, if you're sitting at your desk, you don't need that much fuel to begin with, right? If you're trying to lose that 20 or 30 pounds. And of course, if you're even 10% body fat, you've got 30,000 calories of energy. I mean, you could run a couple marathons with no fuel.
Yeah.
So we don't inherently need fuel, but we're getting those cravings. So that's a big part of the mix for this person who's trying to lose their weight is helping normalize the meals for the day, because one of the biggest misnomers is this idea that the average person, if they consume multiple meals for the day, right, they're going to boost their metabolism.
It revs it up, yeah.
Which is what we see, in the recent meta-analyses. We don't see any of those benefits, and we actually see, increases in actual body fat. So I think if the average person gets back to eating 3 square meals, is a pretty nice place to start. And normally, if you're trying to lose that weight, if you do reduce the carbohydrates at breakfast or lunch, get the proteins and fats up, you'll do pretty well in terms of you can eat a lot of food, you can eat a lot of food that tastes good, and you don't need to think about it so much in terms of counting calories or portion control, which can be really tough when you're going out with clients or family or friends or things like that. So
or you're structuring your social life so it's around food. That can be challenging where people are like, okay, I get up, I eat at 8, 11, and then 1, because they're on that 6-meal-a-day plan. So you found that to be not very effective, right?
I find it's we've almost the norm now in society is let's get everyone to eat every 3 hours and have 5 or 6 little meals through the day. And I think that's a bad norm to start from. I think if the average person trying to lose weight started from this idea of going back to great-grandparents and saying, let's just have the 3 meals. That way, you end up getting into a caloric deficit without really trying.
Yeah.
You end up, the more you can go between meals without getting hungry, typically the better your metabolic flexibility, right? The better you are from burning fats, or rather carbs to fats, versus that person who's overweight and insulin insensitive. They really want to just burn carbs.
Yeah.
That's why they're getting a lot of those cravings, versus the fact that their body should be able to just click over, break down body fat for a fuel source and keep on going. But they'll struggle, right? There'll be some irritability and some cravings. But most people, once they ride that out, they get through to lunch pretty well. And I try to start top of the day with most people, just change that breakfast. And of course, the easy win for reducing appetite is just having a little coffee between the breakfast and the lunch, right?
Yeah.
An appetite suppressant. Most people cruise through to lunch a lot easier than what they would have thought when, initially you tell them. Sometimes people get a little, you can see in their eyes, there's a little bit of fear there, but it tends to work out pretty well.
Interesting. Are you a bulletproof coffee kind of guy?
I think that has a great application in a lot of scenarios, especially for the fitter person, the leaner person, the healthier person. I think if someone's got a lot of weight to lose, I don't inherently want to add more caloric intake to their morning coffee in terms of the saturated fats.
Yeah.
If it's something they really enjoy and it's not taken away, then it's not the end of the world. But for the person trying to lose 20, 30 pounds plus, then that would be one where I try to get them to cook with it at the other meals of the day, but it wouldn't be something I just jump right into trying to add that into their morning coffee. But
yeah, because it still is kind of a meal in a sense. I mean, sometimes 300 or 400 grams of or calories. If you do a lot, right? So
for sure, and I think it's again great applications for focus and concentration, for caloric intake, for lean and fit people as they gotta go through.
Yeah.
And I think it can be, if somebody really is into it, then it can be a nice carrot to dangle in front of them to say, okay, we got to get you eating this way, and then we can. But whenever I give a protocol to a patient, I'm always, especially if it's the first visit, I'm always inherent to the fact that whatever I tell them is going to really relay a message. If I put a bunch of bottles of supplements, then subconsciously they're thinking, okay, the solution must be in the bottles of pills. Or if I give them a very fancy, for lack of a better term, dietary approach, they think I've got to do something really out of the box. Whereas when we tell them, eat your eggs and avocado and berries for breakfast, just put the toast away, or vice versa for lunch, similar with just reducing carbs, they think, okay, well, it's very doable. The answer is actually just off what they're actually doing, and then we can get into the bells and whistles as they go. Yeah,
that's awesome. So I just want to kind of summarize that metabolic flexibility. I think that's a huge point that a lot of people, when they hear that word, they don't really know what it means. And I love how you articulate, after eating a meal, you're going to burn mostly glucose, and then get into fat burning mode over time. And overweight, insulin resistant people can't really make that switch.
Yep.
They're stuck in sugar burning. And so what I heard you say right there is if we can go longer in between meals and not snack so much, we're going to help our bodies kind of entrain them to be more metabolically flexible. That's kind of the idea.
Exactly, and that's where the person will inherently get those cravings in the short term, but it's amazing how, just like a caffeine withdrawal, after a few days, the person starts to say, you know what, I made it through from breakfast to lunch. And most people think, almost think you're going to fall over and die if we don't have food when we get those cravings, but it's amazing. 5 or 10 minutes go by, and people, the craving went away. Whereas in those initial panic phase is when we're kind of looking for those, those snacks and other things.
Yeah, I wonder like how much of this is just habit, right? Where we get into this habit of 10 a.m. you bring your nuts, or you go to the machine at your office, whatever it is, and it's just like we're stuck in that habit.
Yeah, I think habit and environment's two huge things. And they've done lots of studies on, if the snack's in your desk drawer, it's almost 100% of the time you're going to go for it when you're hungry.
Yeah.
If you got to go down the hall to the kitchen in the office, well then it's 2/3 of the time. If you've got to go out your building 2 blocks over and come back, it's down to like less than 20% of the time. So trying to create that environment that's going to lead to your success is a big thing, whether you're in athletics or whether you're just trying to lose that weight, because it's if it's not, it's difficult to make the right choice when you're tired and a bit lethargic and a bit run down.
Yeah.
And people, I do talks down here, all the banks and law firms, I don't think people help each other out with, somebody will bring in that box of donuts or whatever else, and that, again, makes it trickier for people to kind of resist. But if they can do those kind of strategies, it's easy, it's simple, and in the long run, it gets you to where you want to go without having to actually do a lot of major efforts, right?
That's really cool. Speaking of which, like the banks and law firms and things like that, people in vertically oriented buildings where they're not out moving a lot, we talked a little bit about muscle and the importance of that and all the anti-inflammatory properties. Do you have people kind of move around? So we know that sitting is as deadly as smoking now. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think movement is such a huge part, and people are starting to get this idea. It's part of one of the reasons why when we look at European cultures, we always think of, in the French paradox, we try to boil it down to just the resveratrol and the red wine. We ignore the fresh food and the sun and the fact that they're walking around all the time. So that's definitely a big one of getting people to walk more, whether it's if they're commuting in, parking the furthest away from the train and walking, that's where all the parking spaces are, they're ones far away from the door.
Yeah.
Walking into work, taking the stairs, trying to stand more at their desks. We talk a bit about kind of circadian rhythms, and that's the patterns, and the hormonal patterns from the morning to the evening that our bodies are on. Even every cell in the body is really on that sort of 24-hour clock, and exposure to morning light is a big one. And of course, here in Toronto, it's a winter climate. People go from their warm house to their warm car to their warm office and back again without going outside. So even getting exposed to some outdoor light in the winter is really key for helping to keep those rhythms, to maintain those rhythms, and that helps with energy and mood and everything else. Right? So it can be tough when people get fatigued in the wintertime.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder how much the cold influences metabolic rate. I noticed, I was talking with my in-laws the other night, and they spend a lot of time in the UK.
Yeah.
And back in the 1950s and 60s, they central heating was not really a thing, right? And so they would have this oil drip burning system, and you just got the heat that you got. And most nights were really cold. And now we're so cush, like you mentioned, from house to car to office, it's all 70 degrees or whatever. So
that's a really interesting point, because there's a lot of stuff now in terms of just whether it's different forms of cryotherapy or ice baths to induce lipogenesis, or lipolysis rather, fat burning. And my wife's British, and so when you go back to even today, when it's the winter time, you sort of wear like a sweater or something indoors if you're in somebody's flat or house, because it tends to be cooler. Whereas in North America, everything's insulated, like you said, so you can walk around in your boxer shorts in minus 30 degrees and you're totally fine, right? So I think that lack of exposure to some of the elements is definitely playing a role somewhere.
Yeah. Let's go back to movement a little bit. So. As a strength and conditioning specialist, CSCS, do you like people to get under the barbell, do squats and deadlifts, or are we talking just more functional stuff, sprinting? We talked a little bit about earlier, if we can go through kind of the 50-year-old woman who just wants to get her body back, right? Where should they really start?
And that's an interesting one, because again, movement's so key for everything. And when I've got a 3-year-old home, you go to the daycares, you look at every 3-year-old, and every single 3-year-old has a perfect squat.
Yeah.
Right. I'm looking around for the personal trainers. There's no personal trainers in the daycare, so what's going on? Well, we're all born that way. We can all move this way, and then now as we 20, 30, 40, 50, why is it that maybe 20% of the population can move the way they were designed to? So getting people back to being able to move correctly, and squatting is a big one, or lunging or bending. So kind of restoring those movements, and not just I think clients inherently think it's just to build muscle, which for sure that's part of it. But inherently when we're moving that muscle, all the hormonal and metabolic things that happen as a result of that with, insulin function, cortisol function, everything else is kind of a big part of the mix. So restoring a lot of that's key, and then adding some load as they're comfortable, as their movement proficiency increases. And I think building strength is a really good way to frame it for people, because as the misnomer, as I'm sure you know, is if people, especially in female clients, if they're building strength, they're going to get
big and
bigger,
huge,
right? But that's a whole other investment in terms of the way you train and the way you eat. So I think for most people, just getting stronger, and it's nice they can see that change in terms of the weight that they move, even if they're carrying things home or carrying their kids. They can do things that are that maybe they were too weak to do previously, right?
Really interesting. And we talked a little bit about circadian rhythms and so forth. We know that like in the morning we're a little bit more catabolic, and we can kind of, because cortisol is down in the afternoon, or it should be theoretically, depending upon your adrenals.
How many coffees you've had.
Exactly. Do you kind of like optimize training and commensurate with circadian rhythms, or you just say train when you can?
It's an interesting question. I mean, for a lot of people, doing things like basic, very low intensity things like walking first thing in the morning, fast in a fasted state for me is really nice. I mean, I know the research is still not totally clear there, but I think for simplicity's sake, it's really easy for people to say, I'm going to wake up, maybe I'll have a coffee or a green tea, I'll go out and do my walk, I'll do some light exercise at the gym, get it, in and out. I think the biggest problem most people have is they think they need an hour. And if you're new to a lot of exercise or you haven't trained for a while, I'll take 10 minutes.
Right.
I'll take 12 minutes. We'll just repeat squats on the minute or some pushes or some variety of things that we can do in a very short period of time, because that will get us to where we want to go. And again, it gets back to the psychology. They've done studies where they say to the guys, go down and give me 50 push-ups. And of course, only a small percentage of the guys do that. And if they said to them, well, go down and give me one push-up, virtually all of them do it. And the irony is that when they're down there, they do about 20 or 25 push-ups. So it's that getting started that's the toughest part. So I think when you tell yourself, I got to go to the gym and it's going to be an hour, that's a big hurdle to get over. When you tell yourself, I'm going to do some squats at home, bodyweight squats, I'm going to do one set of 15, that's doable. I think that can start the ball rolling, and it's hugely powerful and effective. People just need to trust in the fact that it is versus thinking more is always better.
Yeah, that's a huge point. And then when you start your day off with a positive thing, like meditating, doing yoga, or going on a walk, like you said, it kind of sets the stage for this commitment and consistency. So you make more congruent decisions throughout the day. Whereas if you started out on Pinterest or Instagram and you're kind of irritated that you like wasted your whole morning doing something like not really productive, then that can like precipitate in a bad way. So I love that tip.
Yeah, and I think you're right in a sense that we see a lot of things in terms of performance and productivity from various CEOs saying to really maximize the hours where you're most cognitively productive. So for a lot of us, that's the morning. So be productive in the things that you want to be productive in, and that way by the time you get to midday you felt like you've accomplished some things and there's more room to, whether it's train or go for a walk, those kind of things.
Yeah, really important. So we talked a little bit about leptin. Anything else, because I know that's a kind of a hormone, we talked a little bit about it on the podcast before, but it's new for people, it's involved in cravings and appetite. Is that something that you measure at all? Or?
I mean, you can measure it. I mean, I think it is something that inherently, again, if we think of this sort of environment, this petri dish of the Western diet that we're in, with a lot of sugar choices, carbohydrate choices, lack of sleep. So things like constantly being on the run and stress will throw off this leptin function. Not getting enough sleep will throw off this leptin function. Having too high insulin from too high a carbohydrate. So all the things that most people have issues with are leading to this dysfunction in the hormone that's there to make us feel full. And so it's no wonder then that we again graze and peck all day long. And I think, again, it's inherently not black and white. It'd be fine if we're doing a lot of physical activity, but I think the fact that most of us are sitting at desks all day, we don't need to be consuming so much through the day, especially with a lot of the higher carb stuff. So that's where, leptin gets impacted by so many other routes, and that's why it can be, the science can get pretty complicated when you go down the rabbit hole. When you come back and just tell the person, you know what, you're getting 6 hours of sleep every night, and that's one of the reasons why the insulin function isn't good and the cortisol isn't good and the craving. So let's just get you to, let's add another hour, right? And the first thing that goes is always sleep time. So those are some of the ones where you want to, if you can build up a bigger foundation there, now all of a sudden the next morning we see some great research where now your blood sugar and insulin released to the same meal is better if you've slept, right? Now you need less sugar, you need less caffeine, you can get through. So it all sort of dovetails on itself. And I think people need to just kind of, if you're trying to jump back into it, just pick one thing. Like, don't have 10 items on your list. Just pick one thing. I normally like people to start with breakfast. Do that, build some momentum, and then jump into the next thing. And it's amazing how you can turn people into these intrinsically motivated. Like they're leading the changes versus the doctor or the coach or the nutritionist having to say, did you do 0.4? Did you do 0.5? And of course, they sheepishly say, no, I didn't have time for that kind of thing, right?
So what you're saying is like that small little progress that people get, like whether it's cutting out carbs or getting 8 hours of sleep and they feel better, they're going to want to make better decisions associated with that.
I mean, that's what I see a lot. I change people's breakfast meal. If they were the average person trying to lose 20 or 30 pounds, we get the carbohydrates down at breakfast, the proteins and fats up. I don't tell them what to do the rest of the day. I say, do whatever you want. And oftentimes, by the time they come back in, we ask them what they're eating for lunch, and now all of a sudden they've changed their lunch to mimic what they're doing for breakfast. So I haven't told them to do that, but I've gotten to my goal without having to give them extra information or extra tasks to do. So I think once you get your clients, and that gets back to this whole behavioral side, and whether you're in high performance or general health, if we can coax people in that way, then all of a sudden they're not really following a plan, they just get up and that's what they eat, right?
It's really awesome. Mutual friend of ours, Sachin Patel, talks about like the doctor of the future is really the patient, like exactly what you just said, where people kind of figure it out themselves and realize that there is no one right diet, right? They need to like tinker and test and try it on, see if it fits and adapt.
For sure.
Which is really cool.
And that's the biggest thing too. I mean, when people think they have to abide by something forever, like let's say they have to reduce carbohydrate a lot at first, or if they do want to go down the ketogenic diet route, like once things change, once they become more metabolically flexible, they can, their diets will inevitably evolve with them as well. So, sometimes people think of it like a sentence if they're have to go on a low carb forever, but not always the case, right?
Yeah, really interesting. I recently did a video on the insulinogenic effect of dairy. So it's low glycemic, but it does spike insulin, and some people were commenting because a lot of ketogenic type people were interested in this particular topic, and they're like, oh my gosh, if I have to give up dairy, I'm definitely not going keto. And it goes back to what you were saying. Well, it's like you might want to go full keto for a little while and experience some weight loss or whatever it may be, but it doesn't mean that you're stuck on that, like a life sentence forever on the ketogenic diet.
For sure, and I think for everyone it's always good to come back to this idea of having real clarity in what your goals are. Sometimes we want to be on a certain diet and we don't say, okay, why am I on that diet? What is my goal? Is it to get leaner? Is it to be healthier? Is it to perform better? Because as long as we're chasing the goal, then we can have more room to play with the tool that we use versus just saying, I want to see ketones in my urine, I'm not seeing them, what's the problem? Well, did you lose 20, 25 pounds? Do you feel better? Everything else? Sometimes the ketones become a little bit inconsequential. For others, if they get that cognitive benefit by being in ketosis, then for them it does become an accurate marker. But again, it's all about context, right?
I love that. Literally last night I got a bunch of questions about fasting. And so these women were like, it's two women that looked very lean, people that probably shouldn't really be fasting, right? Because I think it's really great if you're trying to kickstart weight loss or longevity. Yeah. And so they had all these questions about the nuances of fasting. When should I eat? Should I do MCTs or butter? And this, and I said, what's your goal? Why are you fasting? And they didn't reply.
And that's, again, take a step back, think about it. There's some cool research coming out of California too around this idea of just not eating after 6 p.m. too as a way of like getting a lot of benefits of the fasting without having to commit fully to some of those. So just cutting out that evening eating, which is again can be a big problem for a lot of people. By the time you get home, if you got kids, whatever, or evening events, you don't eat dinner till 8, 9, 10 o'clock. And that has an impact too, right?
Yeah, that can be tough. Let's finish off a little bit about cortisol. We kind of brushed on it a little bit, but in your book you talk a lot about how cortisol affects the hypothalamus and affects the brain, and you work with a lot of executives that, again, we talked about kind of burning the candle at both ends. What are some of your modalities? You have supplements and lifestyle stuff.
Yeah, I think one of the first things I always think about is the inputs. So what are the inputs in the system that are creating the drive? Now, some people can inherently be more of that type A, so they've got that natural adrenaline cortisol push in the body. But they could also be consuming a lot of caffeine, right? And finding that right dose of caffeine is kind of a key thing, because again, we can often think more is better, or as life gets busy, you just end up consuming more and more caffeine. But then at a certain point, you'll stop reaping the benefits of the cognitive function or even the fat burning or whatnot, and it'll start to be more draining on the body. So caffeine's a big one. Alcohol's another one. People who are busy through the day oftentimes have a drink or two to take the edge off at night. And although alcohol is a nervine, once you finish half the bottle of red wine, it's probably not, it's definitely not doing that regenerative work on the nervous system. We know it impacts sleep and other things. So again, we got to figure out what are some of the inputs that are creating that environment that are not allowing them to recover and build that resiliency. And then on the back end, in terms of foods, one of the first things for me is fats, especially saturated fats, monounsaturated fats. When you look at a lot of the research on Olympic level athletes, the ones that are in that longer term stress response where we see low testosterone, low cortisol, adding the fats back in a big way is a huge benefit. And you mentioned the bulletproof coffee for that person who's in a good body composition and fit and whatnot. Then getting the the butters, the coconut oils, duck fat's a favorite of mine.
Oh really?
Things like that are phenomenal. Olive oil, avocado. So making sure that the fat intake is up is a key one. And I think some people, when they're trying to get leaner, can sometimes cut the fats down, especially if there's someone who abides by like the calorie that. Calories always matter, but sometimes when we focus just on calories, you end up in that low-fat diet when you're pushing yourself for too long. Those types, especially the execs and people who are training intense, they can get in that rundown picture, and that's where we got to reboot things a little bit and take our foot off the gas pedal and add more of those fats in.
Sorry to interrupt you, but what about the fats? Are they the building blocks for the cholesterol and all the androgens and sex hormones? Is that what we're saying, or they affect the endocrine axis in a different way?
Yeah, so that's the building blocks, like you just mentioned. Cholesterol is essential for health, right? It's one of those things where, again, in medicine, we've almost done a disservice. We've the egg is like the most nutritious food we could possibly eat, and we've scared everyone in the population on eating it more than a couple times a week. Cholesterol is needed for every cell in the body in terms of the cell membranes communicating with other cells. It's the basis for all this, sex hormones, etc. So if we didn't have cholesterol, we wouldn't be here. And when you look at things from this ancestral context, you think, wait a minute, 70% of this cholesterol is made in our body, and we've held on to that ability for 250,000 millions of years. So of course it's got to be beneficial. So the whole argument around just trying to artificially reduce it, you tend to get into some problems there, and that's where even for men, on statins, we start to see then lower testosterone levels, and now here comes another medication for testosterone or another medication for libido, and all of a sudden we're on 3 or 4 different medications when really in the first place, with shifting diet and getting the movement right, we probably could have got to the bottom of that problem without having to do those medications. Yeah,
and you talk about that in the book, that it's really the carbohydrates that are raising blood levels of the quote-unquote bad fats, like saturated fat and cholesterol.
Yeah, and that's a huge one for people, and especially when we do talks for GPs and docs, is this idea that they've taken overweight populations, they ramp up the saturated fat intake, and of course the plasma ones, the one in the bloodstream, those are the dangerous ones, but we think the dietary ones are. And when that same studies, the dietary fats don't increase the dangerous ones in the blood, they then take the carbohydrates and ramp them up in a real stepwise fashion, and that's when you see a skyrocketing of the bad saturated fats in the bloodstream. And so for the person who is overweight, who is out of shape, this is the problem with the breakfast that's now, even if it is the best granola you can find, the very fact that it's 30, 40, 50 grams of carbs for that person is just not going to be the answer, right? They got to get to reducing that and getting the fats and the proteins up for sure.
Yeah, and let's kind of finish off on like Marc Bubbs approved carbohydrates. I know you're big on like the grain-free approach. What do you recommend for people that are training, and then talk about like the timing of carbohydrates and why they should be around exercise?
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of the gluten-free sources of carbohydrates are kind of my first step. So things like root vegetables, things like rices as well, even oats that are not necessarily totally ancestral, but oats can be phenomenal as well. And then from there, depending on the person, we can do various other things. Like some people, the gluten conversation always tends to come around with just this idea of, again, Western diet, cereal for breakfast, granola bar for snack, sandwich for lunch, lasagna for pasta for dinner. We're just gluten throughout the entire day. So if you're not sensitive to it, then just minimize the intake. But for a lot of people, when you add more of the dense root veggies and even things like pulses like lentils, I'm a big fan of as well, the nutrient intake, we're really increasing nutrient density. So those are great first places to go. Things that have a lot of fiber that are nice and slow releasing the bloodstream are definitely big wins. And then from there, it's just figuring out for each person, what the right amount for them is. And the fitter you are and the leaner you are, then typically the more tolerance you're going to have. And starting with exercise, prioritizing your carbohydrates before, during, after exercise, and moving outward is normally a pretty good approach. And for the average person who's just trying to lose weight, in the short term, it's just a good idea to just pull them down.
Right.
Full stop, get yourself losing weight and feeling better, and then you can figure out where you want to, again, around exercise outwards is typically
interesting.
Going to do pretty well.
That's a really good approach, yeah, that around exercise outwards. So like increase a little bit before and a little bit after, but if you're training at 6 p.m., you don't need a bunch of juice and oatmeal for breakfast, right? That's what we were talking about offline, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, again, you can prioritize those carbohydrates. You can have dinner and then train. There's a lot of great research around these like train low or sleep low strategies where we got this fear of if we train hard, we got to eat right afterwards. And again, for the elite performer, we might have different rules, but for the average person, there's a big window there. What you eat over 24 hours is really the main crux of it. So you don't have to inherently try to load up on carbohydrates just because you've trained. If you're trying to lose weight, then getting the fats and proteins in, or even allowing some time. It's not an emergency to get that protein shake in the 30 minutes. If you have to go back to your office and wait a couple hours,
you're not going to start. Your muscles not going to fall off.
They're not going to fall off, and you may even get positive adaptations from waiting a little longer, for sure.
So let's talk about that. The eat low, train low. Can you define that and kind of explain?
So this is the idea where we used to think right after training they had to feed you all of these nutrients to accelerate recovery, and whilst overall that's still a good approach, there's again more advanced techniques where we would then say, Mike, you just trained hard, you're a cyclist, we're actually not going to feed you a lot of carbohydrate, we're going to give you a little bit of protein, and then we're going to train you again in the morning, so you're in this really low glycogen state. That's going to be stressful on your body, but on the back end we're going to elicit some adaptations that are going to help you down the road. Now that kind of strategy is quite good to have, a personal trainer or a nutritionist or somebody working with you if you're new to it, because
it can bonk, crash a little bit.
It can go wrong a little bit, but it's just interesting that we can we can time or manipulate where we're putting the fuel in to give us those adaptive responses. And again, people always think I want to be able to feel amazing when I train all the time, but to elicit a response sometimes you got to feel crappy while you train, and then you feel better down the road versus just always trying to feel great every session. And I think that's where sometimes people get into trouble, because that means you're relying on the endorphins, so you're always in that same energy system, or you're pouring a lot of caffeine or sugar in to give you that sensation too, right?
Really interesting. So people know, like, when they lift weights and they get that burn, they're like breaking muscle, then that causes it to adapt. And then, so quote unquote, like training low, what we're doing is we're kind of doing that same kind of stress to our metabolism, which is going to help over time. Maybe not immediate effects, but long term, that's going to benefit our muscle and recovery. And,
we even see some short-term studies where we see some benefits. So it's kind of a cool strategy for people who are, a lot of people, weekend warriors want to tread that line between like perform well but still be lean for the beach and everything else. So this is kind of a cool strategy to try to manipulate or change your intakes of things to maximize your outputs.
Interesting. Cool. So we only have a few more minutes. I know you have to run, but what are some strategies, behavioral strategies, or dietary strategies that you find that separates like the elite level, like a Canadian basketball player or whatever other athletes that you've worked with, versus the ones that, they have the genetics, but they just don't make it all the way, or they're not around for a long time? Is there any characteristics?
I think at the professional level, genetics is definitely something that sets you up for, especially in a sport like basketball. You're either 6'10" or you're not. But you can definitely, I think in the athletic world, what we've seen now in the last 10 years, 15 years, is that if you take care of your body in terms of what you put in with the nutrition, now from the time you're 30 to the time you're 40, you can really extend your playing career and minimize injuries and whatnot. It used to be unheard of in basketball to play till you're 40, and now people like Steve Nash, etc., Grant Hill, playing in their late 30s, 40s. So this is where we're really starting to realize, even from a rehab perspective, what we're putting in, if a guy has an injury or whatnot, it's going to accelerate things. So I think that's really encouraging, the fact that guys won't, at the early part of their career, sometimes you don't realize that because you just bounce back from everything and you think, well, what's this going to do for me? But as guys or gals start to get a little bit more mature in their careers, they start to think about those things a little bit more, because then when they wake up, they feel a little bit better, and the aches and pains aren't there, and you can just perform a little bit better, right? So longevity, I think, is a big player there for the elite athlete with nutrition.
Yeah, so really being proactive about your diet and nutrition.
Absolutely, proactive and personalizing it for that person, right? If you have a team of 12 people, then you can have some overarching themes, but you really got to have almost 12 separate approaches, right?
Yeah, really interesting. So let's talk about your morning routine. You have 2 kids, you bike and run to school, bike and run to work. That's how you get out here. But we know that very successful people have kind of a set of routines, like we were kind of talking about, like executives and CEOs. That framework really kind of sets the day for productivity. Yeah. What does the first couple hours of your day look like?
Yeah, so for me, it would vary from day to day, but typically I'll get up, early in the morning, try to get into work early to get some admin work or writing work done. In the wintertime, this time of year, I actually do sort of like a bone broth and collagen deal to help with the immunity and whatnot. And then I'll typically go to more of a lower carb, higher fat breakfast. So 3 or 4 eggs, avocado, some greens, leafy greens. And then, from there, fire on the coffee a little on top, and then productivity is great through that sort of morning, mid-morning, and that's kind of normally how I start my day. Some days I'm at home, and it's amazing how when you're out of your routine, things are a little bit different. But I think definitely having a routine and finding those hours where you're most productive and maximizing them, I've found with having kids and time is of the essence is pretty key. Yeah, you have to have that framework, or else you get tugged and pulled other directions, right? Which absolutely, right? Really important. Okay, so you're stranded on a desert island. Vitamin D and omega-3 are covered. Yep. What herb supplement or botanical or food are you bringing with you? Wow, that's a great question. Stranded on a desert island. Well, for me, especially lately, one of the ones that I go to is an Indian herb called Ashwagandha, which is an adaptogen herb. Again, it's very sort of restoring to the nervous system. So wintertime, when we need more kind of building, it's kind of a nice one to go for. It impacts a lot of different areas. So for me, everything around nervous system support is kind of a big one. So cool. I think I'd have to go that route. Yeah, and for you personally, Ashwagandha, in the morning, evening to calm down, like is there any circadian rhythm associated? I mean, I like it in the evening for a lot of clients to help, it does help calm the nervous system a little bit in terms of sleep. And if you get clients who are more just naturally kind of revved up through the day and struggle with being too revved up, then I think some things like your ashwagandhas or even your L-theanines, which is an amino acid that calms the nervous system, or even some magnesium glycinate. Nice. Glycine amino acid can help just to, pull people back a gear if they feel like they're always in that fifth gear and burn it out a little bit.
Yeah, I've been experimenting a little bit more thanks to Charles Poliquin with higher doses of L-theanine, like 1,000 milligrams or 1,500, and for deep sleep it seems to really be effective. So
yeah, it's a great, it's definitely super supportive. It's nice that, as an amino acid, they were, it's sort of food based, so it's great.
Right, definitely. Okay, so final question, Dr. Bubbs. You bump shoulders with a prime minister of a different country, maybe a president of the United States, someone from the World Health Organization. What are you going to tell them in an elevator ride that lasts about 30 seconds?
I think I would just try to reinforce that we're spending an awful lot of money treating people who are sick already. Right? Even the food industry, if you want to really go down the road, we subsidize the types of foods that make us sick, and then we have to pay for it. Especially here in Canada, we have a government subsidized healthcare, and it costs us a lot of money to wait for everyone to get sick to fix them up. And there's very easy solutions. It's amazing what we can do in science and medicine on this very high skill level, but all these basic things of how we eat and how we move and lifestyle could just dramatically reduce all the disease rates across the board. And we don't need any fancy tools to do it, right? We just need to sit down with people and have a conversation.
Love it. Dr. Bubbs, really appreciate you coming on the show.
Awesome.
If folks want to connect with you online, what's the best website and channel?
Yeah, you can connect with me at drbubbs.com, drbubbs.com, and then on Twitter at drbubbs.
Awesome. And then The Paleo Project is the book that you wrote a couple years ago, 2015, I think you said. Talk to us a little bit about that. Is it available all across the web as well?
Yeah, it's available all across the web, and that's sort of a platform for how I practice. If you read the introduction, you get the sense of, again, diet, exercise, lifestyle, and the paleo theme is this ancestral theme of just getting back to eating real food. And the idea why we call it a project is just that individualization, right? Everyone's going to be different with how they apply that to themselves. So for that person, figuring out what those blocks are for them.
I love that. Okay, makes a lot of sense. Awesome. Again, really appreciate your time and wisdom, and thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me on. Appreciate it.